Thank you for being here. We have the session on global value chains and integration. And we have 3 papers. The first paper will be presented by Kıvanç. The second one will be presented by our colleague here. And the third paper also will be online by Insaf. So we'll have 20 minutes for the presentation. And 5 minutes for the discussion and 5 minutes for the Q&As. So Kıvanç, the floor is yours. Would you please share your screen?
Thank you for giving me the chance to present our research. I was hoping to be there, but due to administrative issues, I couldn't arrange it. Hopefully, I will be able to share with you what we have been working on for the last couple of years. So the paper I'm going to present is called Market Integration in the Ottoman Empire and Eastern Mediterranean from the 16th century until World War I. So what we try to do in this paper is basically, as the title suggests, kind of track the evolution of market integration in the Middle East over the very long run. So what do we mean by market integration? So the idea is, through the course of history, initially you have separate cities, regions, closed economies only trading within that region, but over time, gradually, different regions, cities begin to trade with each other. So instead of separate demand and supply curves, you have one demand and one supply curve, and prices and the quantities are determined together. The question is, how did this happen? When did this happen? That's the thing that we try to understand for the very long run. Of course, this is a historical paper, but of course, long run. We're also interested in long run development of economies. So that's what we try to understand. When this question is studied, usually it's the wheat prices that are used. So wheat is used because wheat is, of course, throughout history, the most important necessity. And it's a standard good. That's also an advantage. So you don't have to adjust for quality. It's more or less the same good. And we study it based on prices rather than amount of trade. So you could argue, maybe the best way to understand this unification of markets is trying to measure the quantities traded, but we don't have data on that. But we have data on prices. So using the data on prices, we indirectly try to infer what's going on with regards to integration. Of course, going one step back, so what's kind of the discussions in this literature? So the idea is this process of market unification occurred due to both technological and institutional reasons. So technological reasons is that over time, with technological innovations such as steamships, railroads, telegraph, and so on, communication and transportation became cheaper. So trade became easier, so the amount of trade went up. So that's one line of argument. The other line of argument emphasizes the institutional changes. So over time, as states became stronger, they were able to provide security, and they were able to invest in infrastructure, such as roads, canals, and so on, which again made trade cheaper and risk associated with trade lower. And the idea is this process also helped increase trade. And kind of in terms of timing, we will be talking about Middle East. So for the Ottoman domains, both of these are really occurring in the 19th century. So the steamships begin to work on Ottoman ports around 1840s. Train is much later, actually. So the train lines began to be built around 1870s, but really it's very late, 1890s, that they became widespread. So it's the second half of the 19th century. In terms of political transformation, a stronger state, that's also 19th century. So the Ottoman tax revenues and public spending begins to go up, starting around 1800. So that's kind of what we expect based on these explanations. And what's the contribution of our study? This is the first paper that kind of studies this question in the context of Middle East. There are other papers that work on Europe, China, and so on. In Europe, you see that this integration begins to go up around 1500. So it gradually goes up, and it then accelerates in the 19th century. In China, it's stagnant, and it actually falls in the 19th century. And so the question is what was happening in the Middle East, which is important to try to understand kind of, the economic stagnation, to date the economic stagnation in the Middle East. When did the gap with Europe open up? Okay. So let me start by talking about our data. So for this project, kind of one of the contributions is we built a large data set, about 2,600 annual price observations from 26 cities. So we went to the archives, secondary sources, and so on. And this is kind of summarized in a figure what our data set looks like. So on the x-axis, I have the dates from 1500 to 1914. On the y-axis, I have price of 1 hectoliter of wheat. And each dot is an observation. And we have observations for, different cities in the Middle East and in the Balkans, actually. So this is kind of the cities. Let me show it beforehand. This is the cities. The black cities are the Ottoman cities that we have data for. So we have data for, Middle East, Anatolia. We have a lot of data for Anatolia, and also parts of Balkans and Greece we have data for. But of course, the quality of data varies. So for core Ottoman lands, the kind of center of the empire around the capital, these 4 cities, we have pretty good data going back to 1560s. So we call this the core sample because we can do more for these cities because the core, so each dot, so on the x-axis I have again the dates, y-axis different cities, and each dot signifies a year for which we have data. So for example, for Istanbul, there are some gaps, but until the end of the empire there is pretty good data. And for other cities around the capital, we have good data. So this is the core sample, which we work on the most. Then for about 7 other cities, including Cairo, Salonika, parts of Anatolia, we have good data starting in the 1670s. So we call this the wide sample. These 7 cities are also good enough to do more stuff with. And for other cities, we have fragmentary data, which we also use for some of the analysis. But of course, we cannot use it for the whole set of methods that we use. And we also get data for European cities to kind of put these Middle Eastern numbers in context and compare them. From a bunch of sources. Okay, and then what do we do with this data? So there is a big literature on this, on market integration. So there is this distinction. So there are kind of 2 main ways of trying to measure market integration. One approach is called price convergence. So there the idea is you check the difference in prices between different cities. So the idea is as trade goes up, the price difference, because of arbitrage, the price difference between the different cities will go down. So that's called price convergence. So what you do is basically you check whether the differences between the prices in different cities is going down or not. The second approach in the literature is called efficiency or price co-movement. In this case, you check whether the prices are synchronized. So the idea is if the price in one city goes up, whether it also goes up in other cities. So whether the prices move up and down in a synchronized manner. So we kind of check both. Our data is better for convergence because of the quality of data, but we check both. And then there is also this distinction between domestic and international integration. So we'll first look into whether these Ottoman cities are integrated with each other. And then we'll also check international integration. We'll check whether these cities are integrated with Europe. If we have time. I'm not sure whether we'll have time for international integration, but if there are questions, we can get into that. Okay, so let me first show you what we get for domestic integration. So whether the Ottoman cities are integrated with each other. So the first and straightforward way of trying to measure this is called, the tool that is used to measure this is called coefficient of variation. Most of you will probably be familiar with it. It's basically standard deviation divided by the mean. So for each year, we calculate the standard deviation of the prices in the different Ottoman cities divided by the mean and plot it. So we do this for the kind of the core part of the empire where we have the best data. So that's the black line. The black line is the center of the empire. And the data goes back to 1560s, so we can kind of get a long run view. So this is the coefficient of variation for the core parts of the empire. And then this gray part, gray line is the wider sample, which I showed you started a little later. And here we have Cairo, we have Salonika, we have Damascus. So it kind of gives you a bigger view of the Middle East. Okay, and then kind of to be able to interpret these numbers, in the background we also have the lines for England, France, and Spain. We repeat the same calculation, England, France, and Spain, to give you a sense about, what are the magnitudes that we should be thinking about. Okay, so what do we learn from this exercise? So look at the black line. There is somewhat of a decline at the end of the 16th century. So 16th century, many of you might know, is kind of the golden age of the empire, right? Suleiman the Magnificent and so on. And the literature says things were working well back then. So there seems to be some convergence there. Markets are working better and better. Remember, this is standard deviation divided by mean. So if this goes down, it means prices are converging, markets are working better. But then, for the next 200 years, it's more or less the flat. There are ups and downs, but not much progress. And then in the 19th century, it goes down again. So that's the core lens of the empire. For the wider sample that includes, Salonika, Cairo, Damascus, and so on, it's more or less the same story. Of course, it starts later, but it's more or less horizontal until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, it does collapse. So markets are working better in the 19th century. So putting this in perspective, for France, for example, there is continuous gains. In England, there seems to be continuous gains, of course, more gains in the 19th century. So those countries are building up markets in a more continuous fashion. Spain is more like the Ottomans, so it's stagnant until the 19th century, and then in the 19th century, they build their markets, they unify their markets. So, these are, of course, that's where I'll be going to. These are related to political changes, right? Spain is also stagnant economically in this period and politically. So this does make sense. Okay. Okay. Then we begin playing around with bilateral price differences. So we have 26 cities, and for each year for which we have data, we calculate the price difference for each pair of cities. So Istanbul, Salonika, Istanbul, Damascus, Damascus, Salonika, and so on. That's our dependent variable. And then we regress it. We try to decompose it into time fixed effects and city pair fixed effects. So we're trying to, again, get a sense of the evolution of average price difference between cities. So this is what we get when we plot that. So this is the evolution of time dummies. This is the evolution of, you could think of this as evolution of average price gap between any two Ottoman cities over time. So this is again, ups and downs, but what you see here is the markets are integrating only in the 19th century. Before that, not much change. 19th century, it goes down.
Kıvanç, 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes, okay. And then we run a bunch of more detailed regressions. We find that, of course, these price gaps increase with distance, with trade costs. These price gaps decrease as Ottoman state becomes stronger in the sense that it collects and spends more money. So this is the kind of state capacity argument. Wars increase the price gap. Wars disrupt the market. Monetary instability disrupts the markets. Climate shocks disrupts the markets. Steamship and railroad decreases these gaps. So all of these are kind of expected, but they kind of make the point that it wasn't just politics or it wasn't just technology, it was a combination of both. In the 19th century, things got a little better. And these are the city dummies. So I will have to be fast. So this is basically, if it's red, the redder it gets, the more connected that city is to other cities, in the sense that the price gap is smaller. So kind of what this shows is the core lands of the empire are better connected and the port cities are better connected, which we know because, you know, most of the trade was occurring through the sea. As you go inland and distant from the center, it gets bluer, which means those are not really well connected. Okay. And we also do factor analysis, a similar picture. Ottomans are stagnant, but some gains, less dramatic gains in the 19th century. These are bilateral correlations. Again, most of the market integration is in the core lands, but the kind of the countryside is left behind, even in the 19th century. And when we do similar analysis for connections with Europe, we again find that most of the gains were in the 19th century. Ottomans were better connected. And most of this connection occurred through the port cities. So the overall, what this paper tells us is, you know, Ottomans, the gap with Europe began to open up starting the 16th century. There was stagnation. There was some gains in terms of market integration in the 19th century, but not really catching up with Europe because Europe integration levels were also going up, which helps explain the economic also stagnation in the Middle East over the long run in this period. Thank you. I mean, I have some more material, but of course, I'm running out of time, so I'll be happy to share it if you have questions on this.
Thank you, Kıvanç. Very interesting paper. So as you have seen, this paper uses some historical data to examine wheat market integration in the Ottoman Empire. And what has been found is that the rates of integration in the Ottoman Empire fluctuated without a clear trend during the early modern era. And there was also some spatial distribution that was uneven at the domestic level. Then when we compared Ottoman Empire to the Western and Central Europe, we can see that we had lower gains in the Ottoman Empire compared to Europe because of those institutional differences. So I will provide a set of comments in maximum 5 minutes. A very interesting paper, a very nice contribution to the literature on both trade and economic history in the MENA region, in the sense that it uses really a wealth of data that were collected. We have some papers in economic history on the MENA region, but very few, especially in the trade field, which is very good. And there is really a great potential for a very good publication. I have some specific comments to improve the paper. First, at the theoretical level and the conceptual framework, I think it will be important from the beginning to explain why price data and how price data can measure market or trade integration. Because from the beginning of the paper, we cannot really understand why can price data in general measure trade integration. The first thing that we have in mind that you're going to talk about historical tariffs or free trade areas, but it was not very clear from the beginning why prices convergence should be an indicator of trade integration. And that's why I think it's important to add a first section with a theoretical framework where you explain the channels through which prices can affect market integration. Then, this was perhaps clear at the end of the paper, but not in the beginning of the paper, about which integration we're talking. Is it more within countries integration or between countries integration? And it was clear at the end that you have both domestic and international integration. And that's why I think it will be better to focus, to have really one measure of integration, focus on it and build the whole storyline around this measure of integrations. Clearly, one of the central arguments that that emerged from the paper is the importance of institutions, and it was. I think there are some important references that have to be taken into account, especially when you talk about the role of institutions on integration and trade, especially the two papers of Costino and Nunn and Treffler that show to what extent domestic institutions can matter for trade integration. Then, in the second section of the paper, you are talking about the long-term economic growth. It was not presented during today's presentation, but I think it's better to focus on, again, on the channels through which prices convergence or co-movement can affect market integration. Then, another point, especially in both the introduction and in the literature review, there is a very clear focus on the role of technologies and institutional reforms and how they can affect market integration. However, it was not really empirically tested in the paper. So I don't know if it's really one of the future venues that you're considering, but I haven't seen neither in the empirical part nor in the descriptive analysis how technologies and institutional reforms will be measured. Then this is a minor comment. It was not clear what do you mean by distinctive advantage. Is it more about the comparative advantage or the competitive advantage? But it was not clear to me. For the data, given that data is an important part in the paper, I think we really need a section for data to describe how it was constructed, how you harmonized the prices that you have, because at a certain point in the paper, you mentioned that data was standardized, but it was not clear how the standardization was done, which exchange rate you have been using, and so on. And the choice also between the core versus the wide group of the Ottoman Empire, this was not very clear. And I was wondering whether it's also important to distinguish between coastal versus landlocked cities, in the sense that this matters a lot for market integration and can add another layer of costs to the trade cost, which will lead to a price divergence. On the empirics, in the stylized facts, you are talking about price convergence and price co-movement. And then in the empirical part, you are more focusing on price differences. So I didn't really get why price convergence and price co-movements are not used as a dependent variable instead of the price differences, or whether price differences, they measure price convergence, and in this case, why we're not using also the correlation coefficient as a dependent variable just to harmonize what is presented in the stylized facts and in the empirical part. Another question, given that it's a paper about economic history, for especially at the domestic integration level, because if we're talking about domestic integration, this means that we are within the country's borders, and it was not clear which borders. Are we considering the borders, for instance, Egypt, does it include Sudan or without Sudan by this time? So I think it will be important to have a map where you show the borders that you're using and which cities are within each country, just to understand what we're actually measuring. Final points, given that we're talking about the convergence, definitely, even if this will be at the expense of including some variables in your analysis, I think including bilateral fixed effects will be an important control in your analysis to control for a lot of unobservables between different cities or different countries. And I think this might be costly in the sense that you'll not be able to introduce other variables, but this will make sure that, based on the gravity literature, that we're really controlling for the endogeneity of those bilateral flows. Then, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think it will be interesting to distinguish between coastal areas and landlocked cities, because this was also very well documented in the trade literature. And finally, instead of perhaps of distinguishing between the European cities and Ottoman Empire, it will be better to pool the two data sets and control for the Ottoman Empire with a dummy, for instance. Perhaps, yes, I mean, the central issue is that I think it will be really important to empirically test the two main arguments around technological and institutional change. Then I have some other minor comments, but I will stop here, and thank you for your paper. Perhaps we can collect some questions from the audience, and then you can respond to all questions at the same time. Any questions? Any comments? Okay, no questions, so over to you, Kıvanç. Yes,
Thank
just
you.
a second. No, just a second, one question.
Thank you. My name is Ola Sidani. I'm from Lebanon. And I did my PhD on the impact of institutional absorptive capacity for aid on public debt in MENA countries. So thank you, Speaker, for this very interesting topic that you presented. My question to you, given the current disruptions in the global market and the very weak institutional backgrounds of many countries in the MENA region, particularly those in crisis, what do you think can be a low-hanging fruit in terms of institutional reform that can help integration, trade integration, whether it's through prices or any other way, so as to reduce the cost of trade in order to improve the economics of these countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Second question, and...
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, it was a great study. You collected huge data, and I really know how difficult to collect this data. I wonder, in the regression, you showed us some independent variables and like tax revenue. Do you collect them within this study, or do you refer it to other studies, as we cannot see the paper and as you didn't have time to explain? So that would be good to share that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last question.
Thank you. I'm Nader Habibi. Since the Ottoman Empire lasted for several centuries, there was the period of the rise of the empire and then the decline of the empire. I was wondering if you have done any time division to test your hypothesis in different time segments correlating to different phases of the Ottoman Empire. Thank you.
Thank you. Kıvanç, over to you. 3 minutes to respond to some of the questions, not all. Thank you.
I'll try to answer them all very, very shortly. First of all, your comments were very helpful. I can't go over them one by one. Especially, I think your comment about, our paper is under-theorized. We kind of wave our hands about different explanations, but there is no concrete model. In our defense, our problem is, of course, when you do a historical, empirical paper, you have to explain the history, you have to kind of explain the data. So that puts us in a bind, but this is ultimately an economics paper, so we have to do a better job in that. And I also kind of noted all the other points you made about empirics and data. Thank you for them. For the first question, so what does it tell about integration today? First of all, I mean, this is a history paper, so you should be always very careful about trying to, when you are generalizing historical patterns to today. But if it says something, the first thing it says is trade is good. So there is this debate in the Ottoman literature that, whether 19th century, through partly by force, Ottoman markets were opened. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why we have this increasing integration. And I couldn't show it here, but when you look at the GDP data, this greater integration that we observe in the data is accompanied by increasing per capita GDP. So the first lesson, trade is good. In terms of institutions supporting the trade, what our paper says is you need a strong state that builds the infrastructure. So this can be, we can't really test it, but this can be physical infrastructure in terms of roads, but also legal infrastructure and so on. So this is the period when it goes up. It's the period when these infrastructures are built in the Ottoman Empire. Good institutions matter for trade integration, okay? This is not, rocket science or something unexpected, but it's good to see it in the data over the very long run. In terms of tax revenue data, we have another paper that collected tax revenues for the Ottoman Empire. Kıvanç, Karaman, and Şevket, Pamuk, 2010. If you send me an email, I can send it to you, and it's also on my website. That's where we got it from. And for time periods, Nadi's question, we didn't explicitly put in dummies for different periods. But when we plot the integration levels, those periods, the periods that's discussed in the literature, overlap with what we identify. So very broadly, very simplified, in a very simplified manner, kind of the 16th century is considered the golden age when the empire was strong and, markets were working. We kind of see the upwards trend in that period. And then from 17th to 18th centuries, that's called the period of stagnation. There is some debate in the literature how much of it was the stagnation. But what we find is, in terms of market integration, that's the period where market integration levels stagnate, where they are also taking off in Europe. So that's where the gap begins to open up. And 19th century is more confusing in the sense that that's the period of reform, state building, and so on. So it's, in a sense, kind of you see it in the data. Market integration levels go up. Of course, when it's discussed in the literature, yes, Ottoman state is building up, but, European states are already industrializing, so the gap is not closing. So it's a period of warfare and loss of territory and so on. We also see it in the data. There is some gains, but relatively speaking, there is no catch-up. So in that sense, our data does overlap with this periodization of the Ottoman history.
Great. Thank you, Kıvanç. Thank you so much. Now we move to the second paper. On global value chains and energy transition.
I am happy to be here and to present some preliminary results of our ongoing research project on energy, global value chains, and value-added growth. And this is a joint paper. And let me start with motivation first. Okay, this doesn't work. Okay, our motivation is clear and strong. And first, energy commodities are the top traded items, international trade. And also, energy sectors actually contribute substantially to gross domestic production in many resource-rich countries. And also, we know that energy is a key input in the production process. Without energy, we cannot produce anything. And however, perceptions of the resource curves lead to expectations that the growth impact of energy export will also be negative. Actually, a resource curves hypothesis refers to a well-known phenomenon that resource-rich countries or countries with natural resource abundance actually perform worse than countries without natural resources. This is called resource curse hypothesis in the literature. And some arguments are put forward to explain this negative relationship between natural resource abundance and different macroeconomic indicators like growth, productivity, or institutions. For example, some studies indicate that countries with natural resource abundance would be subject to political instability, conflict, also weak institutional structure. And some studies indicate the role of exchange rate dynamics. And some others indicate volatility of government revenues because volatility coming from commodity price fluctuations. And on the other hand, another strand in the literature investigates the impact of global value chains on growth, productivity, and institutions as well. And we know that global value chains actually have a lot to offer to both developed countries and developing countries as well. For developed countries, global value chains actually make possible to a better finer specialization, and developed countries would retain some core tasks or some high value added tasks or components, parts and components, and they can just outsource low value added parts to developing countries. And also global value chains actually offer a new developmental path for developing countries. Unlike in the past, now developing countries actually would benefit from technological developments, advances, and management techniques developed in developed countries. They don't have to produce everything from scratch. Rather, they can just imitate and join global value chains, and in this way they can increase their production capacities, capabilities. But of course, this is not an automatic process. In other words, joining global value chains, of course, will not solve every problem and every obstacle developing countries face. But surprisingly, the empirical link between energy, global value chain participation, and value-added growth remains largely unexplored in the literature. And our motivation is to merge these two different strands in the literature: natural resource curse hypothesis and also global value chains. And I would like to add that some studies actually investigate specific global value chain participation, for example, textile or cars or others. But as I said, this topic, energy global value chain participation, is neglected, ignored in the literature. And our contribution is threefold. And we make a distinction between the effects of backward and forward global value chain participation in energy sector, and also distinguish between global value chain participation in different energy sources such as coal, crude oil, and natural gas. And also we pay attention to income level, and we make a distinction between developing and developed countries. And we use a standard model to examine the impact of global value chain participation in energy sectors on value-added growth. Our dependent variable is value-added growth, and we have some control variables, including capital stock per worker and backward, forward, overall global value chain participation, and also a dummy variable indicating whether country is an energy importer or not. We have time and country industry dummies, and we use data for 44 countries from 1995 to 2022, and we use fixed effect estimations. And this is important, and we define backward participation as the share of foreign value added in exports, and forward participation is measured by the share of domestic value added of exports that is re-exported to third countries. And also we make a distinction among different sources of energy: coal, crude oil, and natural gas. And table 1 summarizes our mean values, and we can see that actually developing countries have a higher value-added growth rate than developed countries, and this is consistent with expectations, prior expectations. And also capital stock per worker is higher in developed countries than in developing countries. And first, table 2 summarizes our empirical findings for full sample, including both developed countries and developing countries as well. And we can see that both backward participation and forward participation have a positive impact on value-added growth. And also we can see that typically backward participation in energy sectors has a negative impact on value-added growth, and forward participation, on the other hand, have a positive impact, except for natural gas. And then we make a distinction between developing countries and developed countries. We re-estimate our empirical model for developing countries first. And we can see that in developing countries, capital stock per worker has a negative impact on value-added growth. And this just shows some inefficiencies in the use of capital stock in developing countries. And also we can see that, again, developing countries actually benefit from backward and forward overall global value chain participation. And also we can see that total energy forward participation has a positive impact, except natural gas again. And on the other hand, we see that backward participation in crude oil has a negative impact on value-added growth, but not forward participation. And let me remind you a simple fact. Resource curse hypothesis actually is more associated with forward participation rather than backward participation. So these results actually, except natural gas, don't lend evidence for the resource curse hypothesis. And also we estimate separately our model for developed countries, and we can see that capital stock per worker has a positive impact, unlike what we have found for developing countries. This is interesting, and this shows that developed countries actually are better at using their capital stock. They are more efficient, more effective. And we can see that for developed countries, backward participation has a positive impact on value-added growth, while forward participation has a negative impact. And we can see that, again, forward participation in coal and crude oil has a positive impact, while total energy backward participation has a negative impact. And natural gas backward participation has a positive impact for developed countries as well. Okay, we have discussed these results. And our results in general actually are in line with arguments presented by several papers in the literature, like Crespi et al. And Katz and Pietro Belli. They indicate that specialization in energy sectors through forward global value chain participation might increase innovation, learning, and spillover effects. In other words, we cannot say that natural resource abundance actually is a curse. Rather, it seems a blessing in some specifications. Okay, and let me conclude our study. We have focused on the relationship between energy global value chains and value-added growth using a large sample of countries. And our results clearly show that it is important to distinguish between the backward and forward energy global value chain participation. And we should pay more attention to income levels and types of energy sources. And thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Taner, for the presentation. I will start with the discussion, and then we move to the floor. Okay. Thank you very much. So this paper, as you have seen, examines the impact of energy GVC participation on value-added growth over almost 20 years, and it distinguishes between backward and forward participation with a special focus on 3 natural resources: oil, coal, and natural gas. And the main finding was that forward participation in all the types of natural resources increases value-added growth, while the result for the backward participation was less robust and with some heterogeneity that is observed. So I think the paper, it addresses a very important issue, especially for the MENA region, given that it's the region that is really abundant in natural resources. A lot has been done on global value chains, but much less has been done on energy and global value chains, which is, that's why there is a real contribution for the paper. It's innovative in the sense that you consider a dimension that in a heterogeneous way, in the sense that you take into consideration different types of energy, and this is very good. So the paper is a very good start, at least the draft that I received, which was 7-page, it's a good start, but there is a great potential. Some more specific comments. I think it's important to highlight, to better explain the general framework of the paper, because you motivate the paper from the resource curves perspective, but at the end of the day, a large strand of the literature has shown that, especially in the MENA region and in several other regions, it's not about the resources per se, but more about the institutions. So it's more an institutional curse rather than a resource curse. And that's why I think it's important to include the institutional dimension, which is central for both GVC and resources. I'm just citing, the seminal paper of Malem and Torvik on the institutions and the resource curse, and a paper that we've done a long time ago with the Economic Research Forum on the MENA region, that shows that at the end of the day, it's really an institutional curse, not a resource curse. So that's on the one hand. On the other, given that you're highlighting really throughout the paper the 2 dimensions of forward versus backward measures, it's also important to show from the beginning why shall energy-related flows for backward versus forward, they should have a different effect on growth, because this was not very clear, neither theoretically justified. On the empirics, it was not very clear what are the 49 regions. They are countries, cities, geographical regions, because if they are countries, then it will be easier to use countries. Then it was also not very clear, at least in the paper, why we have 40,000 observations, because if we have 28 years and 49 countries, this should be around 2,000 to 3,000 observations. But then when I did the calculations, I discovered that there is an industrial, a sector dimension, and this was not explained in the paper. What are the sectors and what is the level? Is it SITC? Is it ISIC? Is it HS level? This was not clear. And then I think, given that your dependent variable is GDP growth at the end of the day, so theoretically speaking, it should be an augmented growth model to which you add global value chains, a la Mankey, Romer, and Vail 1992. And that's why we need a measure for human capital, for instance, because this is central in economic growth regressions. You already include physical capital, but there is no, for instance, population growth, even if you include labor itself. So I think it would be good to start with a basic augmented growth, classical growth model, and then add to it the GVC variables. Then, clearly a serious issue that we can observe here on the endogeneity between GVC and economic growth, because clearly those countries that experienced higher economic growth might be more likely to integrate into global value chains, especially, for instance, the case of the GCC, for instance. So that's why I think it's important to address this. Then you already include time and country industry dummies, but given that you have 3 dimensions, time, country, and dummies, I think it will be good to try different sets of fixed effects and see whether the results, they remain robust or not. Another suggestion that, given that you have different countries, and in general, if we're talking about natural resources, most of the countries, they are subject to the same external shocks, for instance, change in oil prices or in natural gas prices and so on. So that's why perhaps one of the methodologies also that might be relevant for the analysis would be a cross-sectional dependence method, in the sense that when a shock affects one of the countries, it might affect the other countries, which in turn affects their insertion into value chains and economic growth. Then another important point that was not clear in the paper, why the GVC in oil versus natural gas versus coal should have a different impact on growth. Because at the end of the day, if the 3 of them, they are sources of foreign currency, and that's it, which will affect economic growth, then we should not observe a differential impact between the different resources. But however, oil, for instance, its price is more volatile than coal. Natural gas is cleaner than coal and than oil. So that's why I think adding some specific characteristics for the natural resources themselves will enrich the analysis. And as I said in the beginning, clearly adding the institutional quality will be key, because to show whether the institutional curse argument holds or not. And also, given that we're interested in global value chains and in energy, controlling for the environmental stringency of the country itself is important, because it can affect both. It can affect energy and integration into value chains in general. I will stop here. Thank you so much for your comment, for the paper. And perhaps we can collect some questions, and then you respond to all the questions at the same time. Nargis?
Thank you very much. First of all, I mean, the idea is interesting, but it's very hard to see what's going on here at this moment. As he said, perhaps it's a draft paper, so that would be the reason. So there are many questions I have in mind, but I will try to wrap them up. So first of all, I totally agree, Chahir, you need to make a more robust growth model. At the moment, it is really missing, and what you're gathering would be the missing variable only. So it is very hard to drive a conclusion with what you have at the moment. But your main contribution for me is to get this backward and forward participation. However, I really wonder how they are, how do they change in time? I think if there is no section in the paper related to that, you didn't show it here. I think you need to show them, because that's your contribution, and I really want to see them. How do they change in time, and how do you address crisis? How do you address energy crisis? How do you address Paris Agreement and this net zero emission targets of the countries? Is there any change with them, for example, for coal forward and backward participation? So these are, I think, the main things I would like to mention. So thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
First of all, thank you for your constructive comments and criticisms, and we are going to pay attention to points you have brought up to our attention. And of course, you are right, we should consider cross-sectional actually dimension. And another point, we have tried many different empirical specifications. We have included human capital index, for example, or polity to control for institutional quality and others. But after having tried many things, many different variables in our empirical model, we have concluded that this is the best and robust actually result we obtained. And also we used GMM methodology. We tried to use GMM with collapse option, but since we have very high number of cross-sectional units, actually it was impossible to obtain reliable estimates using GMM. And then we returned back to fixed effect estimations. And of course, it is important to add some time dimensions as well, because it is plausible to expect that over time, some things can change. And also, of course, we can add some additional dummies to our empirical specification. It will be a plausible way to go forward. And as I said, actually, these are just preliminary results, and we are still working on our empirical specification and also interpretations of some results. For example, we are not satisfied with some interpretations, and that is why we are still trying to improve our empirical model and justification. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Actually, endogeneity, of course, is a big problem. And it is not easy to deal with endogeneity.
Great, thank you so much. Now we move to the last paper by Insaf Guedidi. Insaf, would you please share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
So you have between 15 and 20 minutes maximum. Over to you.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Hopefully you can see the screen now.
Yes, but yes, great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Over the past few decades, many countries have looked at trade as a pathway to growth. However, not all countries benefit equally from integrating the global trade system. So even when we look at the MENA region, we see that it's fully integrated in the global trade system, but still does not reap the full benefit and does not benefit from sustainable economic growth. So here will lead us to ask, is it like just being part of the global trade system, or is it more in it? Could it be how countries integrate global value chains and trade systems in which sector makes all the difference? So in this research is about, we will look at how global value chain participation impacts growth, but also we'll look at beyond the surface of trade flows and linear relationships to analyze threshold effects. So we know that global value chains is very, very important to international trade, and because it accounts for approximately 70% of all trade. And actually, global value chain is a driver for growth for many countries through productivity, through technological transfer, skills development, job creation, and foreign direct investment. So it would be very important to see the performance of MENA region in terms of the impact of global value chain participation on economic growth, and to analyze sectoral differences and potential threshold effects. So the research question would be, how does participation in global value chains affect economic growth in MENA countries, considering potential threshold effects and the distinct roles of forward and backward linkages at the sectoral level? So as for the literature, we have a wide literature on the relationship between economic growth and trade under simple linear relationships and non-linear relationships. And most of those researchers, they prove that there is a positive impact of trade on growth. So positive impact of exports, positive impact of trade openness, etc. Now, when we look at the literature of the global value chain measures and economic growth, we see that most of the researchers, they say it's positive, there is a positive impact, but still there is not enough fully empirical studies that study the impact of or the relationship between global value chains and economic growth. And approximately, there is no study, up to our knowledge, there is no study on the impact of the non-linear effect of global value chain participation on economic growth in the MENA region. So here, as for the non-linear effects and thresholds, so the question is trade growth relation non-linear? It actually is, and it's proved by many researchers. But here, if we look at the analysis by region, so the nonlinear effects of global value chains are positive in high growth countries, but they may harm low growth countries. And that's why we are thinking about studying the sectoral integration in global value chains to see if the MENA region has a different effect. As for Africa, and the same for MENA, they both are integrated in forward participation. It means they participate in producing inputs to export, and those inputs will be integrated or will be put in the other exports of the third-party countries or partners. So the research contribution is that we will show empirical evidence for MENA using UNCTAD EURA data for global value chain participation. And the paper employs dynamic panel threshold model, and it distinguishes between forward and backward global value chain integrations, taking into consideration the sectoral level. And we will compare the MENA region with emerging and developing economies. So in this figure, as you can see, that the same for MENA and emerging economies, they are both more integrated in forward participation. So when we say forward participation, it means producing inputs, and backward participation, it means importing inputs that the MENA country will use in their own exports. So here, as we see in the dashed lines, we see that MENA and emerging, as I said, they're both integrated in forward linkages if we compare the backward linkages. But for the MENA region, as for the backward participation, it lags behind the backward participation of emerging economies. However, it's the opposite when we focus on the forward participation. So here, the emerging economies lags behind MENA region when in terms of forward participation. So this is a sector representation of a global value chain participation in forward and backward. So as we can see in the MENA region, it's diversified And as for forward linkages, they are more integrated in mining, acquiring, and financial and business activities. However, for backward participation, MENA regions is participating in sectors like textile, transport, electrical, and machinery. So for the data we use real GDP growth, inflation from IMF, and we use global value chain indicators from EUR database. Trade openness, trade factor, total factor productivity are from the World Bank. And the period we analyze is from 1990 to 2017. And we take, we focus on the MENA region, and when we compare it to the emerging economies, then we are excluding the countries of MENA region. So here, this is the formula helps calculating the forward and backward participation. So for forward participation, we take the value of the domestic inputs in foreign exports divided by total exports and in terms of percentage. And for the backward global value chain participation, it's the value of foreign inputs in domestic exports over total exports in percentage. So here we estimate a dynamic panel threshold model. So here we have our threshold variable is global value chains. So here we have a global value chain variable when it is under specific threshold or above specific threshold. What could be the impact of our control variables and our main variable, which is global value chains on growth. So here the threshold variable is gamma in this equation. This is I hope it's clear from this figure, but I will go through the results in the later in the next slides. But here, as we can see from forward participation, we see that for agriculture, for textile and transport, global value chain participation in forward linkages is positive when we reach a specific threshold of global value chain levels. But for the backward participation results, we see that the results are not very satisfactory. So here we can conclude generally that forward participation is more helpful for MENA region than backward participation, especially if we want to make policy impacts and if we want to see which sectors at which level of participation, global value chain participation we want to work on. So here for MENA countries, forward participation, so it's limited or negative below thresholds, but it is positive for agriculture, textile, and transport. Some sectors like mining, financial services show reverse effects because, as you remember in the graph I presented about the sectoral representation of global value chain participation, it shows that in terms of forward linkages, MENA region, they are more integrated in forward participation in those two sectors, financial services and mining. So we may explain this by inefficiencies. So they already exceeded the thresholds. As for backward participation, so there is a weak or insignificant impact. So there is a minimal benefit in textile, finance, and transport. So if we compare the MENA regions to the emerging economies, so for the emerging economies, they show positive effects when certain thresholds are met in both forward and backward participation. For instance, there is a positive effects below threshold in agriculture, electrical, and machinery, but above these thresholds, there is a diminishing returns in finance, mining, and textile. However, for backward participation, there is a positive effects above thresholds in agriculture, machinery, and mining, but some signs of decline in finance and textile because thresholds are exceeded. So this is quickly as a robustness check to check forward and backward participation impact on growth using fixed effects model. So as you can see in here, the effects, we can see it in forward participation and more specifically in the emerging economies. For MENA, we don't see much of significant impact, whether forward or backward. So here, the impact of global value chain participation on economic growth is non-linear, and it is, and the sectoral aspect is very important because we have different impacts when we are integrated in a specific sector. For MENA countries, forward participation generates growth when certain thresholds are met in specific sectors. However, for backward participation, we see limited or negative growth returns. For emerging and developing economies, they benefit more from both forward and backward global value chain participation, especially in capital-intensive and export-oriented sectors like agriculture, like transport, etc. So the most important thing here is that domestic value-added creation is very important, and it helps reap the benefits of global value chain and achieve growth. So it's very important to manage overdependence also on foreign inputs. That's why we see that backward participation does not really benefit growth when we speak about MENA region. So briefly, MENA economies should promote domestic value-add production before deepening global value chain integration in specific sectors. And it's very important also to improve institutional quality and infrastructure, avoid over-reliance on low value-added exports and important intermediate goods. So it would be great if the MENA region could target sectoral policies to help sectors surpass global value chain participation thresholds and unlock growth. And it's very important to balance openness with strategic development to maximize long-term global value chain benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Insaf. Thank you, Insaf, for the presentation. So this paper examines the impact of global value chains on economic growth in the MENA region and other emerging economies using the EORA database. And the main finding, again, that forward GVC participation is more important for economic growth above a certain threshold. And for the backward results, they are, again, less robust, like in the previous paper. And clearly, from a policy perspective, this is important because the MENA region has a volatile growth and is still very much less integrated compared to other economies. For the comments, perhaps to improve the paper a bit, I think first you will need to restructure the introduction to justify the importance of studying nonlinearities, given that nonlinearities is really the central argument of the paper. So which means that at the end of the day, you need to show why GVC can have a positive effect and it can have also a negative effect, or it can be insignificant from a theoretical perspective. In the sense that whether GVCs are in sectors of low value added, in capital intensive sectors, or the channel through which GVCs can have potentially a negative effect on economic growth. Because really, the threshold idea will be basically based on those arguments. Then a second important point, given that the second main issue in the paper is about the MENA region, you need also to contextualize a bit the MENA region and to show why is it different. Because when we talk about global value chains, directly we think about two things that affect GVCs significantly in the MENA region, which are conflicts and bad institutions. So if we talk about the MENA region without contextualizing those two factors, I think we'll be missing part of the story. A second important point, given that, again, the MENA region is the main focus of the paper, we have to distinguish between oil exporters and oil importers, because they have totally different types of global value chain integration and consequently different growth performance. So you have countries like Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco that are part of global value chains in textile, in automotive industries, in processed food, for instance. But GCC countries are mainly in energy-related GVCs. So that's why we need really to distinguish between both conceptually speaking and empirically speaking later. Then, from a conceptual perspective as well, I think it's important to motivate the paper through the endogenous growth theory and add GVC as a growth determinant which can add to the literature on trade and growth as that you cite in the paper in different places. And clearly also, from a conceptual perspective and from the value-added perspective, you need to justify what is the main value added of your paper relative to the paper of Jithin et al. Of 2022. Because if it's really about the MENA region, then therefore we really need to have a paper that is built around the MENA region argument. Because basically what they do in their paper is that they examine the impact of nonlinearities on economic growth. When we talk about trade and growth, there are some biblical references that have to be there, and I'm just listing them here. I will send them to you because we cannot talk about the role of trade and growth without really including those references. And also other references that might be relevant for GVC specifically and growth, especially the paper of Ashraf and Omar in Applied Economics, where they also apply more or less the same thing, but without a special focus on the MENA region. Wang and his co-authors, they add the environmental dimension to the analysis and again examine this through a panel VAR. So I think those references perhaps can enrich the literature, especially the literature on global value chain and growth, and better justify your contribution from the MENA region perspective. On the empirics, again, as I said in the previous presentation, in your case, we don't have any growth control. So we don't have a measure for physical capital, like the gross fixed capital formation, population growth, human capital, either schooling rate or mainly secondary enrollment. Because we cannot have a growth model without having first the controls and then you add the GVC variable. A very problematic variable in the analysis is trade openness, because trade openness is basically exports plus imports divided by GDP, sorry. And there is a problem of double count because exports and imports are about GVC. And you're including, in addition to that, GVC. So that's why I think that part of the results that are either insignificant or counterintuitive can be due to the fact that you're including both GVC and trade openness. And in addition to that, trade openness is an outcome variable. So it's better to include, for instance, the average tariff, and you have this from the World Development Indicators, which will be more a policy tool rather than an outcome variable, and will be less correlated with GVCs compared to trade openness. In addition to this, I think before running the threshold model, which is a very good model, but we need first to see a basic regression where you introduce GVC and its square term to show that we do have first nonlinearities. And based on those nonlinearities, we can consequently explore the threshold dimension. And as I said in the beginning, given that you're interested in the MENA region, I think that you need to introduce both a measure for conflicts from the ACLED database, and you have a lot of variables that measure either the number of conflicts or the intensity of the conflicts through the casualties, and a variable for institutions like the World Governance Indicator, given that they are really important for the MENA region. A A similar comment to the previous presentation. Also, we need to understand why forward participation should have a different impact from backward one. And I think the next comment will be the first comment that you will get from any referee when you submit the paper, is that the two samples of the emerging economies and the MENA region are really different in terms of size. So that's why I think it's better to pool them in one sample and introduce a dummy variable for the MENA region than interacted with the GVC variable. The GMM has been highly criticized as a method to control for endogeneity. So personally, I would suggest running an IV estimation and controlling for the endogeneity of GVC, like for instance, the GVC integration of the main trade partner or the distance between the countries and the GVC hubs that in Germany, in China, in the US, and this will be a more appropriate way to control for endogeneity. Finally, and I think this will be also from a policy perspective a very important contribution to the paper, is to add some back of the envelope calculations based on your estimations to calculate the contribution of GVC participation to economic growth. We've done that in a paper with Fida Karam on the contribution of trade in goods and trade in services to economic growth in the MENA region. And the calculations are really simple, but they provide really policy results that might be very interesting to show, for instance, whether GVC can contribute more than physical capital or human capital or less to economic growth. Some minor comments that perhaps I will send them to you, and I will stop here. Thank you so much, and we'll just collect some questions and then over to you. Any questions for Insaf?
For robustness check, have you tried another dynamic panel threshold model, like the one developed by Kramer et al.?
Other comments? Okay, no more comments. Over to you, Insaf.
Thank you very much all for your comments. Thank you, Dr. Chahir, for your invaluable insights. So I'll start by answering the last question, then go backward. So as for the robustness check, it's what I made is a fixed effect model, but it will be a good idea also to run another type of threshold model. But the one in this paper is a fixed effect model. So for the comments that were made by Dr. Chahir, as for, thank you very much, because most of them, there are things to improve the paper and to make it look better. So and as for the introduction, I agree on adding like a part on the nonlinearities and also to discuss about more about the MENA region, why it's different compared to emerging and other economies in terms of global value chain participation and also growth, trade and growth. Also, I agree on differentiating between oil exporter and oil importer, as yeah, it's true that global value chain participation, when it is a sectoral, when we focus on sectors, it's not the same, whether it's forward or backward or the sectors themselves. Also, just I will pick a few things. So for the suggestions, I will take them into consideration when to verify the growth, the global value chain, the trade, the growth, to add the tariff and instead of trade openings, and also to test for non-linearity in a simple way in squares, and all of this. And I will also check when doing like pulling the data across MENA, and also to check the endogenous growth theory. So all of this, I agree on most of the comments. So thank you very much. And just one thing to add is that the main thing of this paper, or the main value added of this paper, is not simply to analyze growth global value chain in a threshold side or threshold dynamics, but also to take into consideration the sectoral aspect of global value chain participation, which is not existing or missing in most of the other studies. But sure, I will take into consideration most of the comments in here and the references. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Insaf. So if you don't have any questions, general comments on the 3 papers? If no, then we can end the session with 2 minutes. We were supposed to finish at noon 30, now it's noon 32, so we're not very late. Thank you so much, bon appetit, and we'll recap at 2 p.m. I think. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.